Hey YouTube, welcome back to my channel. My name is Dr. Daniel Kaplan, and my mission is to make psychology accessible to all. In today's video, we're going to talk about various biological influences on the development of psychopathology, and we're going to put a focus on childhood disorders. So we're going to talk about the concept of neuroplasticity, brain structures, things like the hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain. We'll talk about the limbic system, the cortex, the various hemispheres, and then we'll talk a little bit about neurotransmitters and hormones. So that is the lay of the land for today's video. But without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing I want to talk about is the concept of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity, or on the slide it says neural plasticity, is your brain's ability to adapt, your ability to adapt to one's environment, and in the case of traumas, your ability to rewire the brain. And what we see is that depending on the age of the child, there's greater or lesser degrees of neuroplasticity. So in early childhood, we have the greatest flexibility of the brain. And I have seen in some case studies where a child age of 3 or 4 was hit by a car and caused severe trauma to one side of the brain or one hemisphere, and they had to remove that hemisphere. It's called a hemispherectomy. And the neurons that were supposed to migrate to one side of the brain redirected themselves to another part. But so that's when we say neuroplasticity, it's malleability or flexibility or ability to adapt to environmental factors. So we do see experience matters in brain development. So if we look at the maturation of the brain, basic sensory and motor skills develop within the first 3 years of life. When we think of perceptual or instinctive centers, that's early childhood. And then the prefrontal cortex and cerebellum are not rewired until about 5 to 7 years old. And then we have a whole host of restructuring that happens in middle childhood, puberty, and then adolescence. So there's this transformation. And then as it relates to personality, your brain isn't typically hardwired till about 25. But even after that happens, you still have some neuroplasticity. For example, in the case of amputations, there's something called phantom limb, where phantom limb is the sensation that the amputated body part still is on your body, even though we cut the nerve endings. So the fact of the matter is, how does that happen? Well, other neurons migrate to that part of the brain and they settle in. And when you stimulate the areas that were previously used for that limb or another area, it makes you feel like the limb is there. So let me explain a little bit more. So there was a researcher by the name of Ramachandran who basically found that the parts of the cheek were linked to the fingers. So by stimulating different parts of the cheek, he could induce the feeling of different fingers for a phantom limb patient. There's also phantom pain for limbs that aren't there and nerve endings that aren't there. So we see that the neurons that migrated to the unused part of the brain say, I'm taking over. So I did say this, your ability to deal with a traumatic experience changes through time. Now, if we were to see ongoing trauma, that could stunt neuroplasticity. And the younger the trauma or the traumatic experiences, the more complications you have. But as I said, in general, all things considered, your brain is most plastic from about birth to 6, then from 6 to 11, and then 11 plus in that order. We also want to make sure that we protect the developing brain. So we want to avoid exposure to teratogens or these harmful agents that could impact the development of the child, things like substances of abuse and so forth. So if you wanted to see a brain functioning, you could do all kinds of things. You could do an fMRI, you could do a PET scan, a SPECT scan, things like that. But what you're looking at here is a three-dimensional magnetic image of white matter in the brain from a side view or lateral to medial view. So there are other imaging techniques, though. So if you were to use a CAT scan or a standard MRI, those are going to create still pictures of the brain, so you can identify things like tumors on the brain or lesions to parts of the brain or brain tissue that atrophied and so forth. Whereas what this is talking about is more of an fMRI. Functional MRI is dynamic and measuring the brain while it's functioning. So let's talk about nature versus nurture. We'll talk about genes. We understand that genes play a role in the development of a child. We understand that genes are connected to mental health conditions as well. Now, what we need to understand is that genes alone don't explain 100% of mental illness. The environment plays a role too. And rarely is there a singular gene that, so to speak, causes an outcome. So if we were to think about chromosomes and start there, chromosomes are large strands of genetic material. And typically we have 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs. And genes are smaller segments of genetic material that are on the chromosome. And we estimate that there's roughly 20 to 30,000 distinct genes. And based on the Human Genome Projects, we've been able to start to identify various gene-related conditions, whether they be dominant genes, whether they be recessive gene-related disorders, and whether they be risk factors for mental health concerns. Now, I want to emphasize once again from this slide, the biggest point is that rarely is there a singular gene that causes an outcome. Now, we do have something called behavioral genetics, which investigates the connections between our genetic predisposition and observed behavior. And we do these kind of studies by doing family aggregation studies and looking at the role of various family members and whether they have a condition. That's also called a pedigree study, oftentimes. We also have twin studies, which can mathematically compute the relationship between genetic similarity and an outcome. So what's interesting about twin studies is that the more similar both the genetics and the environment are, the stronger the correlation is. So identical twins raised together are going to have a higher similarity in an outcome than even identical twins reared apart. So if we look at the Minnesota twins study, we see there are striking similarities between twins, even if they're reared apart, but not to the same degree as if they were raised together. We also have this idea of molecular genetics, which is the linking specific genes to childhood disorders. And we're trying to understand how genetic mutations alter gene expression or gene functioning. And I often talk about genes being turned on or turned off. So, believe it or not, it's possible to have a specific gene for a psychological condition. And if you're in a low stress environment or the environment is just right, it's possible for that gene never to be turned on and you won't manifest or express that disorder. So our genetic influence is more probabilistic, not deterministic. We also, going back to a previous slide, we said there's no singular gene that predicts an outcome typically. Most cases we refer to as polygenetic inheritance. When it comes to psychological disorders, it's oftentimes the interaction between the various genes and their expression on your behavior. So that's genetics. Now let's talk about the brain structure and function. If you were to divide the brain into its parts, you could divide in many different ways. The three large divisions we refer to as the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. Some people separate out the diencephalon, which is the case here. So the hindbrain is the most inferior part of the brain. When I say inferior, it's in location, not in what it does. So the hindbrain includes, as we'll see, the medulla, pons, and cerebellum. They're oftentimes very critical in vital functioning and autonomic activities. We have the midbrain. The midbrain includes things like the tectum and the tegmentum and the superior and inferior colliculi. We also have in the brain stem, going through the medulla, pons, and midbrain all the way up to the thalamus, something called the reticular activating system, which is responsible for the 3 A's of attention, alertness, and arousal. Now we talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is a relay station. We have connections both in and out of the thalamus to virtually every other part of the brain. So it's almost like Grand Central Station. You can get a train to and from anywhere you want in the country. Same thing with the thalamus. The hypothalamus helps with emotion regulation and is part of the limbic system, which we'll talk about. And then the forebrain technically is everything beyond the midbrain. Everything beyond the midbrain is the forebrain. But after we get past the thalamus and hypothalamus, you have the limbic system, the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is responsible for motor functioning to some degree. So things like Parkinson's and Huntington's disease are connected to the basal ganglia. And then the cerebral cortex is the outermost structure. We're going to do a deeper dive as we progress. So let's go into that brainstem. I said the brainstem includes the medulla, pons, and the hindbrain includes the medulla, pons, and cerebellum. But the brainstem starts with the medulla, pons, goes all the way up to the thalamus, but it excludes the cerebellum. The cerebellum is not part of the brainstem. So when we talk about the medulla, it's responsible for basic vital functioning, things like digestion, respiration, heart rate, things that are important for survival. The pons, we have a series of fiber tracts, as I said, both ascending going towards the cerebral cortex and descending going towards the spinal cord and the periphery. One of the fiber tracts is that reticular formation or reticular activating system. The cerebellum, which is not shown here, is responsible for balance and coordination. If you're ever interested in why you might not be able to walk a straight line when you drink a lot of alcohol, the cerebellum is the culprit. So if we move to the midbrain, I'm going to talk about the superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. The midbrain is responsible for survival more on a sensory evolutionary point perspective. So the superior colliculus is linked to vision and vision survival, and the inferior colliculus is linked to audition or hearing. Now, if you move to the thalamus, I said, is a relay station. What's in the back of the brainstem is something called the pineal gland. Now, the pineal gland is actually pretty important in circadian rhythms, so your sleep cycles. It's also important in the release of melatonin. Now, it should not shock you that melatonin and sleep are connected, because if you go to your local CVS pharmacy and you're saying, I'm having a hard time sleeping, they might recommend you try melatonin as a first attempt to getting to sleep. Now, we talked about the brain stem. I also want to talk about the limbic system. So the limbic system is a donut-like shaped structure, almost like the classic donut that's round with a hole in the middle. And very important structures are here. Things like the hypothalamus, which is responsible for food, thirst, hunger sensation, sexual desire, and temperature, like our temperature thermostat. That's very important for the hypothalamus. The amygdala is responsible for fear, rage, and aggression, another important structure in the limbic system. The hippocampus is responsible for learning and memory, and so forth. So the limbic system, it's kind of our emotion-based system and learning and memory. If we move to the cerebral cortex, the cerebral cortex is the outermost structure. So if you look, we've covered a lot of these things, but if you see my cursor at the top here, or if you're looking at a top-down view, you're looking at the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex can be divided into lobes and hemispheres. If we divide it into hemispheres, you have the longitudinal fissure dividing the two sides, and you have your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. Now, your dominant hemisphere, if you're right-handed, is contralateral to your right hand. So your left hemisphere would be your dominant hemisphere. And the left hemisphere typically is responsible for verbal and cognitive processes. Now, if you're left-handed, about 50% of left-handed people are right hemisphere dominant. So similar to righties, it's the opposite side. But the other 50% have something called codominance, which is a very important thing when it comes to traumatic brain injury or strokes. So if there's damage to one hemisphere and you have codominance, you're going to have fewer functional deficits if you're left-handed. Now let's talk about the lobes. We have our 4 lobes. We have our frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe. A mnemonic is FPOT. So frontal includes things like the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive functioning, judgment, decision-making, planning, personality. You have your motor cortex and your Broca's area for speech and language production. You have your parietal lobe, which is responsible for somatosensory signals, as well as visual spatial reasoning. Your occipital lobe is responsible for visual processing, typically. Your temporal lobe is responsible for speech and language comprehension, as well as the auditory cortex. And if we were to look at emotions, those messengers from the limbic system oftentimes migrate to the temporal lobe to communicate. So if you look at the top right, you see them divided. On the bottom, you start to see some really cool things about the various lobes and when they roughly when they mature, because it's not an exact science. The only thing that I did not talk about on the bottom picture in the right is a corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is a band of fiber tracks that connect the two hemispheres. It's linked to intelligence, self-awareness, consciousness, and it usually matures in that early 20s. So that's your lobes and hemispheres. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is responsible for hormone regulation. So it's linked to things like anxiety and mood disorders. And if we were to look at some important structures, we would start with the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the thyroid, the renal medulla, the kidneys. So the hypothalamus we talked about was responsible for food, thirst, and sex and temperature, but it also communicates as part of the endocrine system to tell the pituitary to start producing hormones. And between the anterior and posterior pituitary, we have a total of 8 hormones produced. That's why some people refer to the pituitary as the master endocrine gland. From there, we have the thyroid, which produces thyroxine. So you might hear a concept called hypothyroidism, which is linked to mood disorders. And then when we talk about the adrenal glands, they're responsible for epinephrine and cortisol. And cortisol is your stress hormone. So we see that there is this pathway that's responsible for mood and anxiety. In fact, we refer to the part of the pathway of the endocrine system as the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and it is linked to mood and anxiety. In fact, this is one of the reasons why you will hear me describe mood disorders and anxiety disorders as cousins, because they share this pathway and they also share neurotransmitters. So let's get in there. What are neurotransmitters? Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers in the brain. And when they bind to a receptor site, they're going to alter the next neuron's electrical properties, either making them more likely or less likely to fire. If we were to think of neurotransmitters related to mental health concerns, we talk about the big 6. That is acetylcholine, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, GABA, and glutamate. Now, your book focuses on 4 in particular, but I want you to know acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that's responsible for learning and memory and is linked to Alzheimer's. And I want you to know that glutamate is linked to seizure-based conditions and so forth. But the 4 we're going to talk about are serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, and GABA. And one of the reasons why we talk about this is because pharmaceutical drugs oftentimes harness these 4 neurotransmitters to either elevate the levels of these neurotransmitters or to reduce the levels of these neurotransmitters as a way of altering mental health disorder. So if we're to look at the 4 that we put on the previous slide, we said GABA is linked to anxiety disorders. Well, if you take benzodiazepine, that's going to reduce anxiety. It's an anxiolytic. Dopamine is linked to pleasure-seeking activities, so it's linked to things like schizophrenia. It's linked to ADHD. it's linked to substance use disorders and so forth. Norepinephrine is linked to emotion regulation. In fact, when we talk about bipolar disorder, we're going to talk about the switch theory. Low levels of serotonin and high levels of norepinephrine lead to oftentimes a manic state. And then serotonin is linked to sleep-related disorders, eating disorders, mood disorders, and anxiety. So these are the four that we talked about. I intentionally covered acetylcholine and glutamate because they're not on here, but are part of the big six. And that is kind of a very brief depiction of the biological factors that influence mental health. So I'm going to stop there. If you found this video useful, hit the like button, subscribe, or click the notifications tab. If you had a question on the video or you had a comment or reaction, put it in the comment section below. I read and respond to all comments. But until next time, take care, everybody.